Welcome to Omni Academy. This is Maria, and today we are starting our first lecture on the development of tongue. So, I have summarized the development of tongue into a table, so it would be easier for you to learn this topic. So, the table is divided into four sections. The first section represents the embryonic precursors. These are the sources of development we need to develop different parts of tongue. Second section represents the intermediate structures. These are the structures that are derived from the embryonic precursor, but in the later life, these structures will be converted into the adult structures. The third section represents the adult structures. These are the structures that an adult or well-developed human tongue contain. The fourth section represents the innervation or the nerve supply of different parts of the tongue. So let's start with the first source of development for tongue, which is the pharyngeal arch 1. The pharyngeal arch 1 is giving rise to two structures. Number 1, the median tongue bud, and number 2, the lateral lingual swellings. The median tongue bud in the later life will be overgrown by the lateral lingual swellings, but the lateral lingual swellings will be converted into mucosa of anterior two-thirds of the tongue in lateral life. So this means that the pharyngeal arch 1 is giving rise to mucosa of anterior two-thirds of tongue. So let's now talk about the nerve supply of mucosa of anterior two-thirds of tongue. So the sensory supply to this area is by the lingual branch of mandibular division of trigeminal nerve, and the chorda tympani from the facial nerve is innervating all the taste buds except the circumvallate papilla on the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. So let me explain this with the help of diagram. So you can see in this diagram that this is the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, and this area is the posterior one-third of the tongue. And in this diagram, you can see that these are the lateral lingual swellings, and the lateral lingual swellings are derived from the pharyngeal arch 1. So these lateral lingual swellings in the later life will be converted into the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, this area. So now let's move to the second source of development for tongue, which is the pharyngeal arch 2. The pharyngeal arch 2 is giving rise to copula, and the copula in the later life will be overgrown by other structures, which means that the pharyngeal arch 2 is giving rise to no specific structure in well-developed human tongue. So now let's move to the third source of development for tongue, which is the pharyngeal arch 3. The pharyngeal arch 3 is giving rise to large ventral part of hypobranchial eminence, and this part will be converted into mucosa of most of posterior one-third of tongue in the later life, which means that the pharyngeal arch 3 is giving rise to mucosa of most of posterior one-third of tongue, and this part of the tongue is supplied by the sensory branch of glossopharyngeal nerve, and the glossopharyngeal nerve is also supplying the circumvallate papilla. So let me explain this with the help of diagram. So you can see in this diagram that this is the posterior one-third of the tongue. And you can see that this is the hypobranchial eminence, and the large ventral part of the hypobranchial eminence, which is derived from the pharyngeal arch 3, is giving rise to the most of mucosa of posterior one-third of the tongue. So now let's move to the fourth source of development for tongue, which is the pharyngeal arch 4. The pharyngeal arch 4 is giving rise to the small dorsal part of hypobranchial eminence, and this in the later life will be converted into mucosa of small region on dorsal side of posterior one-third of tongue. And this area of the tongue is supplied by the sensory fibers of superior laryngeal branch of vagus nerve. So this means that the pharyngeal arch 4 is giving rise to mucosa of small region on dorsal side of posterior one-third of tongue. Let me show you that in diagram. So you can see in this diagram that the hypobranchial eminence is derived from two sources. This yellow area of the hypobranchial eminence is derived from the pharyngeal arch 3, and this green area of the hypobranchial eminence is derived from the pharyngeal arch 4. So the area of the hypobranchial eminence, which is derived from the pharyngeal arch 4, is giving rise to mucosa of small region on dorsal side of posterior 1/3 of tongue. But the part of the hypobranchial eminence which is derived from the pharyngeal arch 3 is giving rise to the mucosa of most of posterior 1/3 of tongue. So now let's move to the fifth source for the development of tongue, which is occipital somites. The occipital somites are giving rise to myoblast, and the myoblast in the later life will be converted into intrinsic muscles of tongue. These muscles of tongue are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. So this means that the occipital somites are giving rise to the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So now let's move to the sixth source of development for tongue, which is the head mesoderm. The head mesoderm is also giving rise to some myoblasts, and these myoblasts, which are derived from the head mesoderm, will be converted into platoglossal muscle in the later life. And this platoglossal muscle of the tongue is supplied by the pharyngeal plexus of vagus nerve. This means that the head mesoderm is giving rise to the platoglossal muscle in adult or well-developed human tongue. So let me summarize the process of development of tongue. So the mucosa of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is derived from the pharyngeal arch 1, and the mucosa of the most of posterior 1/3 of the tongue is derived from the pharyngeal arch 3, and the mucosa of small region on dorsal side of posterior 1/3 of tongue is derived from the pharyngeal arch 4, and the intrinsic muscles of the tongue are derived from the occipital somites, and the platoglossal muscle of the tongue is derived from the head mesoderm. So this was today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will be discussing a clinical scenario. So see you in the next lecture.